Good morning. Today we find ourselves with Joseph, our fourth character in the Hebrews Hall of Faith. This is Joseph, not of the Technicolor dream days and being Pharaoh's prime minister, or Joseph falling out with his brothers and being sold into slavery. This is Joseph at the end of his life, after having been reunited with his father, burying his father, and also being reunited and reconciled with his brothers. Joseph in Egypt is dying, and instead of looking back on his life, he looks forward. And even in death, even in dying, he is able to prophetically see beyond what is the current circumstance and gives instructions about his bones to be taken when the people are visited by God and that they are taken out of Egypt. Joseph makes it into the Hall of Faith because we are reminded that even when it looks like God's plans are not going to be fulfilled and God is not going to fulfill his promise because of all that seems to be going on, that seems to be going wrong, God has an ability to work and transform and enable his faithfulness to be demonstrated in our lives. And Joseph's life is testimony to this. Joseph says something very significant to his brothers when they come to him after their father dies, and they're worried that Joseph will bear a grudge for the rest of his life against them for what they did to him in his youth. And when they come to him, Joseph's response is this: "Do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God? Even though you intended to do harm to me, God intended it for good, in order to preserve a numerous people as he is doing today." Joseph had a rock-solid faith in the ability of God to transcend and transform all the mess and the trouble and the strife that his brothers had brought into his life. Joseph, out of anybody, had the right to be angry and resentful for what had happened in his life. Separated from his father for most of his lifetime, his beloved father that he had a special relationship with, and separated from his family, from his land, from his culture, having to make a life for himself in Egypt, starting with nothing as a slave, being falsely imprisoned, going through all those hardships, and then ending up in Pharaoh's court as prime minister. Joseph had every right to turn round to his brothers and say no. Of course, that doesn't mean to say that reconciliation is something that is easily achieved. Maybe it took all that lifetime to be able to reach that place. But we have recorded here Joseph's words, and they are words of faith. He may not have felt them, but he believed them. He believed that God intended it for good and was able to do something with all that was broken and troubling in his life. He recognised that his life was a small part of the greater promise that God had given to God's people. At the end of his life, Joseph demonstrates himself to be truly part of the people of Israel. It's almost as if he's probably lived all his life in Egypt, and so everything about him would have been Egyptian. He would have thought like an Egyptian, acted like his house would have been Egyptian. He would have taken on board their culture, and the funeral that he gives for his father is very Egyptian. But of course, inside and the way that he speaks from his heart, Joseph identifies as being part of the people of Israel, of God's people, because he believes in God's ability to fulfill God's promise, that there will be a visitation of God and God will lead his people out of Egypt to the promised land. There will be rest. Joseph recognised that his life was only a small part of that larger plan. And he also recognised that Egypt was a passing, it was for a season. That's an incredible thing to do, considering it stretched the entirety of Joseph's life. You would probably expect his descendants to have the expectation that they would live the rest of their lives in Egypt. And yet Joseph has this sense of provisionality, this humility, that actually this is just for a season. It may have dominated all of my life. Egypt may have shaped all of who I am, and yet, I know that God's purposes are deeper and wider than this, and that there is a land beyond this that God is calling his people to, and he will visit them and lead them out. And that's why Joseph comes into the Hall of Fame. It should encourage us today that even when we may feel stuck in a situation not of our making, perhaps like Joseph, God has the ability to resolve and transform and work out his purposes, because he's utterly committed to fulfilling his promises, because he is faithful. The other thing we perhaps can learn from Joseph's life is that Joseph doesn't get stuck. He doesn't get stuck in grief and grudges about his brother. And he doesn't get stuck in Egypt. Egypt is not the be-all and end-all for him. We may have plans, and we might surround our horizons with those things that we want to achieve or that we see as important. But it's God's deeper plan in our life that should ultimately define who we are, so that when trouble comes or when things don't look like they are working out, our plans are frustrated, we can say with Joseph the words of faith which says, actually, I believe God will fulfill his plan. God will bring about what he intends. And that can be a hard place to be. And yet, if we truly trust God, it can also be a place of tremendous peace. Peace on the way. Not that we've arrived at the place of God's fulfillment of his promise, but that we have peace in the knowledge that God will do it. And that's what we see in Joseph's life today.